Okay, so our next speaker is Mark Hyman. Now, he is the committee chair representing the ACT Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, otherwise known as the AWAC or AWAC. The ACT-AWAC is the statutory committee under the Animal Welfare Act that advises the TANS Minister on animal welfare matters. He has 40 years' experience as a bureaucrat, mainly within the Commonwealth Government, and has chaired a wide variety of bodies. Mark holds degrees in science, arts and law, and was also a member of the Commonwealth Administrative Appeals Tribunal from October 2009 to October last year. So please welcome Chair Mark Hyman.
Thank you very much and good evening. I'm here without a slide. I could see I was talking after someone who'd be showing you pictures of greyhounds. Also, our committee is not that photogenic, especially its chair. And as you have heard, I do chair the AWAC. I should say that AWAC is made up of 11 people, including me, and we don't always agree on everything. So what I'm going to say here tonight, I'm putting forward on behalf of myself alone, and you shouldn't read what I say as representing the views of the committee. I came at the question of looking forward to 60 more years of animal welfare from the point of view of where will the debate about animal welfare matters move over the years ahead. Animal welfare started off 150, 200 years ago being about things like anti-vivisection and people beating their cart horses too much, and it's moved on to various different issues as things have changed around it, and to be fair, I think as various gains have been made. But an animal welfarist friend of mine said to me, she said, I think things are getting worse rather than better, and the reason they're getting worse in some respects, of course, is that we have moved, as a number of speakers already noted, into such an intensive animal husbandry kind of world that vast numbers of animals are living really very difficult and uncomfortable and unpleasant lives, and this has moved the debate along, and the debate will move again in the future, and I'm going to think a little bit about those kind of moves. So I'm going to touch on 4 issues, and I'll try and spend most of the time on the 4th of those. The first one is, as I just said, animal husbandry. This is the issue which is probably front and centre as an animal welfare issue for most people most of the time. When you think about, we've heard mention of chooks, and we've heard mention of pigs in particular, we've heard mention of sheep and cattle as well, and of course the live animal trade certainly gets people very excited. But if we think about this from the ACT perspective, of course, most of those industries are not major players within the ACT. We've had layer hens, of course. We had caged hens here for a long time. Those have gone now. We now have a barn egg operation in the ACT. That's taken some of the heat out of the issue, of course, but it wouldn't be fair to say that there are no animal welfare issues in barn egg operations. Indeed, it's probably impossible to have any kind of intensive animal husbandry without having animal welfare issues to confront. But the ACT, for geographical reasons, is not going to be the place where a lot of those issues are the most important considerations. So that leads me to my second animal welfare consideration, which relates to which is exemplified by what I think of as the number one animal welfare issue in the ACT each year, which is the annual kangaroo cull. And that illustrates the more general point I'm getting to, which is to do with human-wildlife interaction. We live in something which is often called the bush capital, and this means that we live cheek by jowl with very significant wildlife populations. And we're going to hear about them from our next speaker, Martin, over there. But one of the things I think we need to recognise is that the problems that we see with the kangaroo cull each year are largely problems that have been created by us in a sense. I mean, we have created conditions in which kangaroos can thrive. they can live on plots of land. It's probably difficult for them to find their way elsewhere when they exhaust the food sources around them, and so problems arise. If I look ahead, we can see the population of the ACT probably continuing to grow, and we can expect, I would have imagined, that human-wildlife interface problems are going to appear in all sorts of different forms at all sorts of different times. I mean, just recently, for example, we had an instance where 7 or 8 magpies had to be culled. They had to be culled because people had fed the birds, and the birds had become aggressive and were now expecting food and were demanding food, and they got too aggressive and something had to be done. But again, it really does look like a problem about creation. I understand that the Chief Minister's partner has made some intemperate remarks about the need for possum control. But there'd be a lot of Canberrans who are grappling with living cheek by jowl with possums and do so on a daily basis. So I think we can expect to see more of these problems come along. I think we ought to be thinking rather more creatively about how to solve them, but even more about how to prevent them and how to manage that human-wildlife interface rather better. And I would like to think that we should, by and large, find that the environmental interests and animal welfare interests are not in conflict, as they seem to be in the kangaroo cull instance, but can be cooperative. The third issue I was going to turn to was the use of animals for entertainment. This is ground that has already been rather well covered. We've just heard about greyhounds, of course, but there are lots of other examples, many of which have gone. As Shane pointed out earlier, we don't have cockfighting in the ACT, we don't have dog fights, I'm glad to say we don't have bear baiting, we don't have animal circuses, we don't have rodeos. Greyhounds, of course, is an area which is very much in the public mind, but very, very similar issues do arise when you look at horse racing. Training, racing itself, the very high levels of wastage that you see with greyhounds also occur with horses. Gambling and money, of course, make everything that much more complicated and difficult. So, will we still be seeing racing in the ACT in 60 years' time? Like Shane, I have my doubts about that. So, now I turn to the fourth and what I think is perhaps the most controversial part of what I'm going to talk about. And that's about the connection between violence against animals and violence against people. Animal cruelty and interpersonal violence. When I looked at the literature in this area, I found there's been an enormous amount written about this connection between the abuse of animals and various forms of violence against people, especially domestic violence, violence against women, against children, elder abuse, and so forth. And a number of common themes arise in this literature. Animal cruelty is part of a sort of spectrum of family violence of various different kinds. Animal cruelty by children as a signal of future antisocial or abusive behaviour. Animal cruelty by children as a signal that something is wrong within the family and that there are existing abusive relationships within it. And on a slightly more positive note, the potential of animals as therapeutic agents in and after abuse situations. And now these are actually fairly contested areas in the literature, and there's a lot being done in the way of gathering experimental data and trying to draw correlations and so forth. But it is well established that there is a connection between violence against animals and interpersonal violence within families and other forms of interpersonal violence. This has been reflected in the standard psychiatric manual, the DSM-4, since the 1980s. It's been recognised for quite a long time, but it's there. Viewed objectively, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that this kind of connection exists, because all of these forms of violence involve quite significant power imbalances and power asymmetries, which allow the more powerful in a relationship to abuse the less powerful. And if you think about it, of all the power imbalances you can think about, probably the most profound and extreme is that of people who are animals. And let's face it, animals are not going to grow up and challenge you, and they're certainly not going to take the witness stand against you. We have quite a high profile for these issues just at the moment. We have the Royal Commission into, the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, and Related but rather different sort of thing is the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. I say related but different. You can see that the institutional child sexual abuse is very easily seen as another example of something that can come from power imbalances. I would hope that over time the research that illustrates the connection between animal and interpersonal violence will start to clarify the nature of that connection, make the picture that is emerging clearer and more satisfactory as a basis for policy change. I don't pretend to be an expert in this field, I'm not a criminologist, but I think it's likely that we will get a rather better picture as the years go past and be able to take action rather more confidently. There are already signs that courts and governments elsewhere are starting to move on this. So you find in some states in the US, for example, domestic violence orders can extend to animals and things of that kind. There's not a lot happening, I suspect, yet in Australia, and we need to start seeing some of these connections made, even if tentatively, by governments and by courts and by police, and in the end, we'll have to see them made in legislation, I think. So how might this happen? One of the things, and again, I'm not close to this, and I don't know how accurate I am in saying this, but I wonder whether the people who deal with animal cruelty, a lot of whom are connected with RSPCA, for example, in the ACT, how closely they are connected to the police who are dealing with family violence, and whether those communications work very well, whether there's a silo issue there that might need to be addressed. There are examples elsewhere. There's one in Charlotte, North Carolina, for example, where there's been a conscious attempt to get those two groups of compliance people working in cooperation to try and draw some of these connections. But there does need to be a recognition that there's a connection and that it's worth reflecting on and trying to make sure that the communication works well. And eventually that connection will need to be reflected in the justice system and in how the courts and prosecutors look at these issues. And realistically, I think that recognition is going to have to come from the family violence or the interpersonal violence side. And it's much less likely to be successful if people who are interested in animal welfare ask for it to happen. It would be good to see realistically the recognition happen on the interpersonal violence side and come to the animal welfare people looking for those connections and that information flow to try and draw some of those connections out. Now, making these connections won't stop the abuse of animals, but it does offer a chance of initiating changes that would encourage a much earlier recognition of a propensity for violence against animals or others, that would perhaps allow earlier interventions to monitor and educate before rather than after offences are committed, and that brings us back to something that's already been raised about education. To recognise the potential of animal cruelty to be the starting point for wider problems in antisocial behaviour and law enforcement, and to encourage communications and cooperation between those undertaking compliance in related areas. This is a long path. There's a lot, I think, that is still unknown and only just being explored and needs to be drawn out in a lot more detail and with a lot more confidence. But it's an interesting area to think about in terms of the potential for change over the longer term, and for the people who are concerned about animal welfare to take the whole thing much more seriously, which would be, I think, a lot of people in this room would find very welcome. So there are some ideas about animal welfare and where it might head in the ACT in future years. None of them are revolutionary, but I hope they will offer food for thought. Thanks very much.